Hollywood sold us dreams, glamour, romance, heroes larger than life. But behind the velvet curtains, Elizabeth Taylor saw something far darker. As one of the most powerful women to ever survive the golden age of Hollywood, she witnessed secrets the industry spent decades burying. Men protected by fame. Crimes softened into rumors. Victims silenced by contracts and fear. In her final years, Elizabeth Taylor no longer played by Hollywood's rules. She had outlived the studios, the moguls, and the lies. And before she died, she began speaking, not always loudly but clearly, about the men whose power hid cruelty, whose charm masked predatory behavior, and whose reputations were built on silence. This video is about 6 celebrated actors whose names once symbolized greatness, and what Elizabeth Taylor understood about them long before the world was ready to listen. Elizabeth Taylor did not merely live through Hollywood's golden age, she endured it. From the moment she became a child star, the industry placed her inside a machine that rewarded obedience and punished resistance. Studios owned her image, dictated her behavior, and quietly decided what truths could never reach the public. To the outside world, she was beauty incarnate. Inside the system, she was a witness. As a young actress, Elizabeth learned quickly that power in Hollywood did not belong to talent or morality. It belonged to men who controlled contracts, casting, and careers. She saw how actresses were evaluated not only for performances, but for how manageable they were. Women who resisted advances or challenged inappropriate behavior found their roles disappearing. Those who complied were protected, temporarily. Elizabeth Taylor survived because she understood the rules without accepting them as just. She married, divorced, battled addiction, and faced relentless public scrutiny, yet she remained employed and powerful. That survival gave her access. She attended private parties where behavior changed the moment doors closed. She listened to whispered warnings passed between women in dressing rooms. She saw careers rise overnight after silence, and collapse after truth. Unlike many of her peers, Elizabeth did not romanticize the men who abused their power. She watched as celebrated actors were quietly shielded after accusations surfaced. Studio lawyers reframed incidents as misunderstandings. Publicists attacked accusers' credibility. Newspapers echoed the official story. Elizabeth saw the same pattern repeat again and again. The industry protected its investments, not its people. What separated Elizabeth Taylor from others was memory. She remembered names. She remembered victims. She remembered how easily charm erased accountability. And she remembered how the industry justified everything by calling it the way things were. As she aged, Elizabeth's leverage grew. Studios needed her legacy. Audiences trusted her honesty. She had outlived many of the men who once frightened everyone into silence. And slowly, in interviews, conversations, and private exchanges that would later surface, she stopped protecting Hollywood's myths. She did not always name names publicly, but she made clear that greatness on screen did not equal goodness off it. Elizabeth Taylor did not expose evil for attention. She did it because she knew silence was the final favor Hollywood demanded, and she was done paying it. To understand why Elizabeth Taylor waited so long, you must understand the code that governed Hollywood for decades. It was not written in contracts, yet it was enforced with ruthless efficiency. Speak out, and you were finished. Not just fired, erased. Studios operated like governments. They controlled the press, the courts of public opinion, and often the law itself. If an actress accused a powerful man, she faced immediate retaliation. Roles vanished. Agents stopped returning calls. Rumors appeared in gossip columns questioning her stability or morals. The message was clear: truth was expensive, and women paid the price. Many actresses were young, isolated, and financially dependent on the very men they feared. Some were immigrants. Some were teenagers. Almost all were replaceable in the eyes of executives. Hollywood convinced them that survival required silence, and then convinced the public that silence meant consent. Elizabeth Taylor watched this happen repeatedly. She saw women confide in each other but refuse to go public. She saw accusations dismissed as bitterness or ambition. She saw how easily an actor's charisma outweighed a woman's pain. And she saw how the industry reframed abuse as romance, dominance as masculinity, and coercion as passion. Abuse was not discussed as abuse. It was discussed as how things are. Young actresses were warned quietly. Older actresses were expected to forget. Men were forgiven before accusations were even denied. Elizabeth Taylor's later anger came from this normalization. She realized that the industry had trained generations of women to doubt themselves, to minimize what happened, to believe endurance was strength and silence was maturity. She rejected that lie. By the time Elizabeth began speaking more openly, the code was cracking. Lawsuits were surfacing. Journalists were asking harder questions. Victims were no longer entirely alone. Stay until the end, because what she knew, and why she waited so long to speak, reveals the most disturbing truth of all. Hollywood didn't just enable evil. It rewarded it. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was untouchable, not because he was innocent, but because he was indispensable. A global icon, a pioneer of cinema, and a man whose influence stretched beyond Hollywood itself. Elizabeth Taylor grew up in an industry that treated Chaplin less like a human being and more like a monument. And monuments, she learned, were never questioned. Chaplin's pattern was well known inside Hollywood, even if it was softened for public consumption. He pursued extremely young girls, some barely teenagers. He married girls far younger than himself. He was repeatedly involved in scandals involving underage relationships, coercion, and control. In one of the most infamous cases, he was accused in a paternity lawsuit that exposed deeply troubling behavior. Yet once again, the system worked to protect him. What disturbed Elizabeth Taylor most was how Chaplin's genius was used as a shield. His defenders argued that his art placed him above ordinary morality, that his personal life was irrelevant compared to his contributions to film, that accusations were misunderstandings or exaggerations fueled by ambition. Elizabeth saw through this immediately. She watched how the industry framed Chaplin's victims as opportunists rather than children. How newspapers romanticized his relationships as unconventional love stories. How age gaps were dismissed as eccentricity. And how Chaplin himself never truly faced consequences equal to the harm described. Elizabeth later spoke about how dangerous this narrative was. When brilliance becomes an excuse, abuse becomes invisible. Chaplin taught Hollywood that cultural importance could outweigh accountability. That if a man was valuable enough, the rules simply did not apply to him. By the time Elizabeth Taylor reached the height of her power, she rejected this logic entirely. She understood that genius did not erase exploitation, it amplified responsibility. And she understood that Hollywood's refusal to confront Chaplin's behavior sent a clear signal to other powerful men: talent grants immunity. Charlie Chaplin was not protected despite the accusations. He was protected because of them, because acknowledging them would have shattered the illusion Hollywood depended on. Elizabeth Taylor knew that truth long before the public was ready to accept it. John Wayne. John Wayne was never just an actor, he was an idea. To America, he represented strength, patriotism, and a rigid vision of masculinity that Hollywood exported around the world. That image made him untouchable. And according to many women who worked around him, it also made him dangerous. Elizabeth Taylor encountered John Wayne in an industry that treated him as a living monument. His authority on sets was rarely questioned. Crew members deferred to him. Studio executives indulged him. And women, particularly younger actresses and assistants, were expected to tolerate behavior that would have ended another man's career. Over the years, numerous accounts described Wayne as verbally abusive, intimidating, and openly hostile toward women who did not conform to his expectations. He was known for crude remarks, aggressive posturing, and an environment of fear that followed him from set to set. While formal criminal charges were never brought, the pattern of behavior was widely discussed in private, and carefully ignored in public. Elizabeth Taylor later made it clear that she rejected the myth Hollywood built around men like Wayne. She understood how masculinity had been weaponized to excuse cruelty. When a man was labeled tough, his aggression became acceptable. When a woman objected, she was labeled difficult. What angered Elizabeth most was not just Wayne's behavior, but the way the industry normalized it. His conduct was framed as old-school rough-edged charm. Complaints were dismissed as sensitivity. The message to women was unmistakable: endure it, or leave. Elizabeth Taylor refused to romanticize that legacy. In her later years, she openly criticized the culture that celebrated dominance while silencing discomfort. She understood that harassment did not always leave bruises. Sometimes it left fear, humiliation, and careers quietly altered. John Wayne remained protected because he symbolized something Hollywood did not want to dismantle. Elizabeth Taylor knew that symbols are often defended more fiercely than truth, and that made them the most dangerous of all. Kirk Douglas. For decades, Kirk Douglas was praised as a trailblazer, outspoken, influential, and fearless in challenging Hollywood norms. But behind that reputation was a story the industry worked tirelessly to bury. Elizabeth Taylor knew it. Many actresses knew it. And one woman, for years, carried the weight of it alone. Natalie Wood later confided that she had been sexually assaulted as a teenager by a powerful actor, an allegation that her sister Lana Wood publicly identified as Kirk Douglas. The incident allegedly occurred early in Natalie's career, at a time when refusal could destroy everything. No charges were filed. No investigation followed. The accusation remained a whisper, until it couldn't anymore. Elizabeth Taylor was privately furious when the story resurfaced years later and was immediately questioned, minimized, or dismissed. She recognized the familiar pattern: discredit the victim, protect the legacy, and invoke the absence of legal action as proof of innocence, ignoring the reality of fear, power imbalance, and systemic silencing. What made this case particularly disturbing to Elizabeth was the timing. Natalie Wood was young, vulnerable, and desperate to succeed. Douglas was established, respected, and shielded. The imbalance could not have been more extreme. And yet, Hollywood responded exactly as it always had, by doing nothing. Elizabeth Taylor understood why Natalie Wood had remained silent for so long. She understood because she had seen what happened to women who spoke too early. Careers vanished. Reputations were destroyed. Trauma was compounded by disbelief. In her later reflections, Elizabeth made it clear that justice delayed by fear is not justice denied by truth, it is denied by power. She rejected the idea that greatness in film erased responsibility in life. She rejected the notion that time absolved harm. Kirk Douglas died celebrated, honored, and defended. Elizabeth Taylor knew that history often remembers men kindly, unless someone is brave enough to interrupt the narrative. Her refusal to stay silent was not about vengeance. It was about acknowledgement. And for the women who were never believed, that acknowledgement mattered more than Hollywood ever understood. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando was hailed as a revolutionary, the man who reshaped acting, masculinity, and emotional realism on screen. But Elizabeth Taylor understood that revolutions can hide casualties. To her, Brando represented a turning point in Hollywood where genius became a defense strategy, and art became an excuse powerful men used to cross lines that should never have existed. The most disturbing example emerged from the filming of Last Tango in Paris. Actress Maria Schneider later stated that a sexually explicit scene was altered without her consent, leaving her feeling violated and humiliated. Though the incident was defended at the time as necessary for realism, Schneider described long-term emotional trauma that followed her for decades. She said she felt betrayed, not only by Brando, but by an entire system that applauded the result while ignoring the cost. Elizabeth Taylor was deeply unsettled by this defense. She rejected the idea that authenticity required cruelty, or that a woman's boundaries were expendable in service of cinema. In private conversations and later reflections, she criticized the industry's willingness to elevate male intensity while dismissing female harm as collateral damage. What troubled Elizabeth most was how quickly the narrative shifted. Brando's reputation remained largely intact. The film was celebrated. Awards followed. Meanwhile, Schneider struggled, personally and professionally, while her account was debated rather than believed. Elizabeth recognized the familiar pattern. When abuse was reframed as artistic brilliance, accountability disappeared. Consent became negotiable. And women were expected to sacrifice themselves for a legacy they would never fully share in. Brando's case marked a new phase of Hollywood protection, one where harm was no longer denied, but justified. Elizabeth Taylor understood how dangerous that evolution was. Because once cruelty is reframed as creativity, there are no limits left to cross. Errol Flynn. Long before the word predator entered public conversation, Errol Flynn became the blueprint for how Hollywood protected dangerous men. To audiences, he was the swashbuckling hero, charming, fearless, irresistible. To the industry, he was too profitable to lose. And to Elizabeth Taylor, he was one of the earliest lessons that fame could erase almost anything. In 1942, Errol Flynn was charged with statutory rape involving 2 teenage girls. The accusations were explicit, detailed, and horrifying. Yet the public reaction revealed something far more disturbing than the charges themselves. Newspapers mocked the victims. Headlines framed the case as scandalous gossip rather than criminal behavior. Fan clubs rallied behind Flynn, painting him as a victim of temptation rather than a man accused of exploiting minors. Elizabeth Taylor was still young, but she was old enough to see the machinery activate. Studio publicists went to work immediately. Flynn's image was aggressively protected. The girls' characters were attacked. Their motives were questioned. Their pasts were dissected publicly in ways Flynn's never were. The courtroom became theater, and the verdict, not guilty, was celebrated as proof that charm had triumphed over accusation. What haunted Elizabeth Taylor later in life was not only the verdict, but what followed. Flynn's career did not suffer. It flourished. He was welcomed back into Hollywood without consequence. The message was unmistakable: the system would not only defend him, it would reward him. Years later, Elizabeth spoke privately about how that case changed her understanding of Hollywood forever. She saw that evidence did not matter as much as image, that the law bent when celebrity leaned on it, and that young women, especially those without power, were disposable. Errol Flynn became a warning whispered among actresses. Not because he was unique, but because he proved what men could get away with. Elizabeth never forgot how quickly the industry closed ranks around him, or how eagerly the public accepted a comforting lie over an uncomfortable truth. This was not an isolated incident. It was a template. And Hollywood would reuse it for decades. Roman Polanski. Roman Polanski's case was different, and that difference exposed Hollywood's moral collapse more clearly than any scandal before it. In 1977, Polanski pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. The facts were not rumors. They were court records. And yet, when he fled the United States before sentencing, much of Hollywood responded not with condemnation, but with sympathy. Elizabeth Taylor was appalled. For her, this was the line no one should have crossed. The crime was admitted. The victim was real. And still, powerful figures rallied around Polanski, framing him as misunderstood, persecuted, or unfairly targeted. Some minimized the assault. Others emphasized his talent. A few attacked the justice system itself. Elizabeth saw this as the ultimate betrayal, not just of the victim, but of every woman Hollywood had ever asked to stay silent. She spoke openly against the industry's defense of Polanski, rejecting the notion that artistic achievement could outweigh accountability. To her, this was no longer about whispers or unproven allegations. It was about whether Hollywood would finally choose morality over myth. The industry's response was revealing. Polanski continued to receive awards. Standing ovations replaced outrage. Invitations replaced consequences. Elizabeth recognized the pattern instantly, but now, the excuse of uncertainty was gone. This was the moment Elizabeth Taylor understood that Hollywood did not merely fail to protect women. It actively resisted doing so. Her stance against Polanski marked one of her clearest late-life condemnations of the system she had survived. She no longer softened her words. She no longer deferred to reputations. She understood that silence now would make her complicit. Roman Polanski's continued celebration forced a reckoning Elizabeth had anticipated for decades. And it confirmed what she had long known: Hollywood's greatest loyalty was never to justice, it was to itself. To many observers, the question lingered for years: if Elizabeth Taylor knew so much, why didn't she speak sooner? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. Silence, in Hollywood, was never passive. It was engineered. Elizabeth understood timing in a way only survivors do. Early in her career, speaking out would not have exposed powerful men, it would have destroyed her. Studios still controlled distribution, publicity, and access. Newspapers relied on studio advertising. Courts often sided with money and influence. Truth spoken too early did not disappear quietly, it was buried aggressively. Elizabeth Taylor also understood leverage. She waited until she had something most women never received: immunity. By the later stages of her life, she was no longer dependent on studios for roles or relevance. Her legacy was secure. Her public trust was immense. She had outlived many of the men whose power once silenced entire rooms. There was also another reason, one rarely discussed. Elizabeth knew that naming names before the culture was ready would only re-traumatize victims. She had watched women speak out and be torn apart for decades. She refused to be the spark that burned them twice. Instead, she planted warnings. She spoke in fragments. She criticized systems rather than individuals, at first. She waited for journalists to become braver, for audiences to become less forgiving, and for victims to realize they were no longer alone. Elizabeth was not waiting for courage. She was waiting for conditions. In her final years, the industry had begun to crack. Lawsuits surfaced. Patterns emerged. Whispers turned into investigations. Elizabeth recognized the shift. And when she spoke more openly, condemning the protection of abusers, rejecting excuses framed as art or masculinity, her words landed differently. They stayed. Elizabeth Taylor did not expose evil impulsively. She did it strategically. She understood that truth is not just about what is said, it is about when it can survive. For every powerful man protected by Hollywood, there were dozens of women whose names never became famous, or whose fame ended the moment they spoke. Their stories rarely made headlines. And when they did, they were often framed as cautionary tales rather than victims. Elizabeth Taylor remembered them. She remembered actresses who vanished from casting lists without explanation. Assistants who quietly resigned. Young women whose difficult reputations followed them forever after refusing advances. Some turned to substance abuse. Some left the industry entirely. Some carried trauma silently into ordinary lives, never telling their stories publicly because Hollywood had already taught them the cost. What unified these women was not weakness, it was isolation. They were discouraged from speaking to one another. Confidential settlements included non-disclosure agreements. Legal threats ensured silence. Even friendships were monitored. The system worked because it kept victims separated, doubting their own experiences. Elizabeth Taylor saw how language was used as a weapon. He's just intense. That's how it's always been. Don't ruin your future. These phrases became shackles. Abuse was normalized. Survival was reframed as success. When Elizabeth later advocated for victims, not just in Hollywood, but through her activism and philanthropy, she carried these women with her. She understood that visibility could be protective. That belief could be healing. That acknowledgement mattered, even decades later. By the end of her life, Elizabeth Taylor had reached a conclusion that was impossible to unsee. The greatest villain in Hollywood was never a single man. It was the system that trained everyone to protect them. Actors came and went. Accusations surfaced and faded. But the structure, studios, lawyers, publicists, executives, media alliances, remained intact. This system did not exist to seek truth or justice. It existed to preserve profit, image, and power. And when those goals were threatened, morality became negotiable. Elizabeth understood that Hollywood did not merely ignore abuse, it organized around it. Contracts were designed to silence. Non-disclosure agreements were normalized long before the public understood their purpose. Gossip columns were fed selective narratives. Victims were isolated, discredited, or reframed as unstable. Meanwhile, careers of powerful men were rebuilt again and again, sometimes stronger than before. What made the system so effective was its ability to disguise itself as culture. Abuse was reframed as romance. Control was reframed as passion. Violence was reframed as intensity. When these stories were repeated on screen often enough, they became believable off-screen. Audiences were trained to forgive what they admired. Elizabeth Taylor rejected that training. She saw how Hollywood rewarded silence with opportunity and punished truth with exile. She saw how even well-meaning people participated, by looking away, by repeating excuses, by telling themselves it wasn't their place. And she understood something devastatingly simple: evil does not need universal approval. It only needs enough cooperation. By speaking out late in life, Elizabeth wasn't trying to rewrite history. She was trying to interrupt it. She knew that some men would never face consequences. She knew that some stories would always remain incomplete. But she also knew that naming the system mattered more than naming every individual. Because systems outlive people. Elizabeth Taylor's final warning was not dramatic. It was precise. If Hollywood did not dismantle the machinery that protected abusers, new names would simply replace old ones. Different faces. Same outcomes. Same silence.